Hi everyone, my name is James, and today I'm going to show you how I built this walnut pull queue display case. Before I begin today, I would like to remind everyone of a giveaway that we have going on that's going to end October 1st. If you watch my last video on how to make through dovetail joints, the keepsake box that we made in that is the one we're giving away. If you're interested, check out that video for details. Okay, back to today's project. One of my viewers on YouTube contacted me and asked if I could make a pull queue display case. I thought this might be a great project to illustrate some different woodworking techniques. This type of construction is perfect for any small display case or even a shadow box. The first thing that I've done is I've marked the walnut to cut around the knots that we don't want in the project and to cut all of the different pieces down to size. As with any project, we always joint one edge first and then rip the opposing side on the table saw to end up with a parallel cut. And here I am cutting out the pieces for the side of the cabinet. I will go ahead and cross-cut them all down to size as well. I just want to take a moment to thank all of the people who support this channel, from the Patreon supporters to the people who subscribe to the people who purchase things through Amazon through the links that are in the description. All of those things go to help support this channel and make these videos possible. Thank you. Okay, so there's our collection of pieces that it takes to build this project. The four on the top are going to end up being the door, and everything else is for the carcass. So the next step that I want to do is I want to take all of these pieces and I want to mill them down to the exact same thickness. After face jointing one side flat, I'll mark the top, and then I'm going to take them over to the planer to plane that part down to make sure the top and the bottom are parallel with one another. Now this step would be completely unnecessary if I had bought stock that was planed down to uniform thicknesses, but I actually bought some of this at different times, and so they were different thicknesses, and I wanted everything to be the same because I'm going to use Dado and Rabbet joints to hold this together, and it just would be nice if all of my pieces were the same thickness. It makes cutting the dados a lot easier. So with the dado blade installed in my saw and my miter gauge supporting my piece, I'm going to make the first dado along the top of the side of the project, and this is going to hold the top part of the cabinet. I've got my fence located so I know exactly how far down that dado is going to be. There are a lot of dado blades on the market, and I'll put a link to my favorite one, the one that I use, in the description of this project in case you're interested. And I'm just cutting that top dado on the other side. So the next thing I have to do is cut a rabbet on the other end of this cabinet side. A rabbet is very much like a dado, but it's at the edge of a board. And since I don't want to put my blade against the edge of my aluminum fence, I am going to put a sacrificial wooden fence against it so that I can rub the blade against that. The clamps I'm using to hold that board there are called universal fence clamps, and I'll put a link to those in the description in case you are interested in those. And there's the photobomber. We haven't seen her in a little while. So you can see I'm rubbing the blade right up against the edge of that. That way the rabbet that I'm going to cut goes right to the edge of the board. And cutting a rabbet is basically the same procedure as cutting a dado. I use the miter gauge with a board on it to kind of support the wood from the back. I like to hold it down with a nice hold down. I'm using a gripper there. And we just pass it over the blade and it makes our rabbet cut. If you happen to be in the UK or many other parts of the world, this cut is called a rebate instead of a rabbet, but it's the same cut. And that completes the two of those. The next thing I'm doing here is putting a rabbet at the back edge of the two sides of the cabinet, and this is to hold the plywood back that I'm putting on. I'm cutting a particularly deep rabbet, which you'll find out why a little bit later in the video. It'll be easier for me to explain at that point. My rabbet is a little bit, that I need is a little bit wider than my blade cut, so there was a little bit left at the edge. So I had to flip that over, move the fence away, and cut the last little portion off. One thing to note when you're cutting these is that it is important to hold them down very tightly with a push block the whole way so they don't ride up, and that way you get a nice flat rabbet cut all the way along the edge. And finally, I am going to do a small rabbet cut on the top and bottom part of this cabinet as well. And one of the advantages of having a sacrificial fence is that I was able to bury the blade down into the wooden portion of the fence in order to cut this rabbet to the right width that I wanted to. I didn't have to get my blade, take it apart, make it narrower. I could just move it into the fence. Okay, so now we get to assemble it and take a quick look at what all those rabbets and dados were for. And hopefully you can kind of see the little pocket that's on the inside that's going to hold our sheet of plywood. And the sides are going to extend up past that. And here it is, I've set it up on my bench and I've put the top and bottom portions on top of that part that we just dadoed together just to get a look at it. And since this particular display cabinet is to hold pool cues, I'll need to spend a little bit of time carefully marking out all of the holes that I need. I do have the top and bottom pieces clamped together here, back to back. That way I can draw my lines straight across and mark them so when the pool cue goes in the hole in the bottom, it goes perfectly perpendicular or vertical, straight up through the hole in the top as well, so they don't look slanted. And then I'm just using a little punch to mark the exact location of the hole, which will help me locate it with the drill bit later on the drill press. And you can see I have them all laid out there, so now it's time to take these over and drill them at the drill press. If you ever have to drill nice flat-bottomed holes into a project, the only bit you can really use is a Forstner bit, and I'll put a link to Forstner bits in the description so you can take a look at them if you need to. I'm just going to give it a light sanding before assembly here. So now I'm drilling the holes through the top. On the top side, the holes have to go all the way through. And if you ever have to drill a hole all the way through, you really need to have a solid wood block in the back in order to prevent tear out. Now I realize that there's a block on the drill press and I can drill through that, but it has various holes in it of various sizes, so if I just use that, I'd still get tear out. And you can probably see, even on the block that I'm using, I use a different spot on the block for each hole, so I have a clean piece of wood to drill into. And now the top is complete, so it's time to do some assembly. It's important to keep the carcass of this thing straight and square as you're assembling it. And so I like to hold squares in place while I do that. And another thing that I'm going to do is run a few pin nails in to help hold them in the exact location. Pin nails are very, very tiny. They're like small needles with no head, and they're invisible once the project is sanded and complete. I use pin nails for a great many projects to tack things together and prevent them from moving. Okay, so now we're starting to get the clamps going, and at this point it's a good idea to use a wet cloth and get all of the glue out from the inside. And then what I like to do is take my squares and just hold them in the corners and very lightly clamp them into place. Now, these are very heavy gauge aluminum squares, so I don't really think there's any problem with putting some clamping pressure on them, but I do keep the clamp pressure very, very light. It's just enough to hold this carcass square. There's really no strain or stress involved there. And then I'll just put a series of clamps all the way around it to secure it and let it dry. So while that's drying, I will move over and cut the backer. I'm going to use a piece of cherry plywood, 1/4 inch plywood, for the back of this project. I think the cherry being a little bit lighter in color than the walnut will add a nice accent and allow us to see the pull cues a little bit better as well. And we'll do a quick check for square to make sure it did stay square and there was no problems there. And so now to put the cherry plywood in, I will use both glue and some pin nails. We of course did a dry fit first, which is very important. You never want to try to glue two things together that you have not first attempted to dry fit together. And here I'm going to put a little thin strip of walnut on the very top part of the cabinet here to hide those holes. This will make more sense, I think, when we get to see this completed from the front. Okay, so now I'm going to move my attention to the top and bottom pieces of walnut, which will go on the cabinet, and I'm going to route a 45-degree chamfer on the top edge of the bottom one and on the bottom edge of the top one. I think this chamfer bit is probably the most commonly used bit in my workshop. And I will go ahead and sand both this top and bottom piece thoroughly before we glue it together and assemble it. And next I'm going to go ahead and glue the top one on here. I'm going to get glue on both the top of the cabinet and on the top piece as well. And I'll make sure it is centered from left to right. And if you notice the top sticks further out of the front than it does off of the sides, that's because I'm going to have a door on the front here. And once the door goes on, that adds 3/4 of an inch thickness to the front. And then I'll have uniform overhang all the way around. And the same procedure from the bottom. We'll get it glued on thoroughly and then centered from left to right and clamped down. And here it is clamped up and drying, and we used a wet rag to clean up all of the excess glue before that could dry in place. So next it is time to cut the rails and stiles for the door. Even though I designed this whole project on SketchUp and I knew exactly the size of the door before I began, I never cut my door pieces to size until the body is completely done. and then I double check my measurements of the body, and then I cut my door pieces to fit the body. In the past, I have many times made an error and went ahead and cut these beforehand, only to find out that my door was too big or too small because I made some tiny error in the building of the cabinet. You can avoid all of that if you just simply wait and cut your door pieces after the cabinet is done. Okay, so now I have to cut the coping cut on my router table. This is a coping sled that I have, and if you're interested to know how to make raised panel doors, I do have a video on exactly that, and I can put a link to that in the description. So I'm just going to kind of go through it quickly here, but remember there is a more detailed one if you're interested. And then after the coping cut, I make the rail cuts. I do have two router tables, so I typically put the coping cut bit in one and the rail cut bit in the other, but you can also just as easily switch bits out and just have one router table. And this will be the last of the rail cuts here. And so now all of my door pieces are complete. Now I won't be making a raised panel or anything for this because this is going to have a glass panel door. And there's a quick look at the body of the display cabinet. Okay, so now we're going to glue these rails and stiles together. If you've seen my videos in the past, you know that I am a big fan of gluing both sides of every joint in a project. I just want to make sure I have the strongest possible bond, and I will clean the excess off later. When you put the rail into the stile here, it's important to make sure that the corners line up just right before you put clamping pressure, because it's kind of hard to move them around later. And now we glue the other stile onto this side, and we're ready to clamp it up. Once again, I want to clean off the excess glue before it has a chance to dry. It's a lot easier to clean this off now than it is to scrape it off later. And I also like to do a quick check once this is put together to make sure my frame is exactly square. And this one does look pretty good. So now I'm going to take this door frame back to my router table where I have a rabbeting bit installed. I have to completely remove that back lip of wood so that my glass panel will slide in easily from the back side. I could have assembled the door with the glass panel in place, but then if the glass ever broke, we would never be able to replace it. So it's better to remove this lip of wood all the way around, and then we can just slide the glass panel in place, kind of like a picture frame, and we can hold it in with some glass retaining clips. Another thing you might notice is the corners are rounded because that's what that bit does on the router table. So we'll have to take this back to my workbench, and I'm going to have to chisel the corners square. And you might notice I do not have top-of-the-line woodworking chisels, but one thing I do is I make sure that they are always very sharp. I've probably had these for 25 or 30 years, and they've just gotten old and rusty with age because of the different workshops I've been in, but I do always keep them very sharp. And so now I am doing a little bit of hand sanding, and I like to knock the sharpness off of the corners by hand. I still want them to look square, but I don't want them to be sharp. So I'll check the fit and feel of everything. And then next it is going to be time to mark the locations for the hinges. I'm using a Blum soft close hinge, and so I need to have a line indicating the center point of where these hinges are going to be mounted. And once again, I do have a video that details exactly how to build and install raised panel doors. So here I've moved around to the back of this display cabinet, and I have marked where the hinges are going to be. And the problem with most soft close hinges is they're very deep, and these hinges actually have to protrude slightly through the back of the cabinet. Not really a big deal. It's pretty common practice. So I've clamped some blocks on the front to prevent tear out, and I'm going to use a Forstner bit in just the right location and drill a hole that's about the size of the back of that hinge so that it fits through the edge of the cabinet. And you can see the test fit there. That's how it's going to be when it's all installed. So I can go ahead and mount this here, and I'm using a drill bit that's called a VIX bit, V-I-X. It's a self-centering drill bit that drills a hole to the very center of that location, and then I'll use a screw and I'll put it in. If you don't use a VIX bit for this type of operation, your drill bit could end up to one side or the other, and then once you put the screw in, it can shift the location of your hinge. So whenever doing hinges, it's very important to use a self-centering bit. I'll put a link to one of those in the description in case you'd like to look at that. And so now I am going to put the holes in to the door for those hinges. It's a 35 millimeter hole, and it has to be gapped 7 millimeters off the back for the particular hinge that I'm using. And I have my center line there marked on the door. I'm not sure if you can see that, but that's where my hole location is going to go. And these have to be drilled exactly 1/2 inch deep, and I have my drill bit or my drill press set a stop set to stop at that point. And so now we'll just take these hinges, we'll use the self-centering bit again to mount them into the door. You will need to be extremely careful here if you are going to use a drill or an impact driver to sink these screws. They're very delicate and it's very easy to strip, so just go really slow. And if you don't have a whole lot of experience with your impact driver, then it's probably best to put these in by hand with a hand screwdriver. Then you don't risk stripping out the hole. If you do strip out the hole, it's really very difficult to fix that. After taking everything apart and sanding it, I'm going to go ahead and put it all back together again here. Okay, so now we can see what it looks like there, and we can see how the door opens and closes. And we can still see a little bit through the holes where the hinges went through, but we will take care of that in a future step. So now we have to consider how we're going to mount this onto the wall. This display case, once it's full of pull cues, will be quite heavy. So unlike a picture frame, we probably don't want to use a wire to mount it. So I'm going to design a French cleat system. French cleats are a really unique way of hanging things on a wall, and they'll hold a tremendous amount of weight. So I have decided to do that, and I'm going to thin down a piece of cherry here to about 1/2 inch thick and use that as a French cleat. The French cleat piece that goes on the cabinet has a 45-degree angle cut on it, and the one on the wall also has a 45-degree cut on it, and they mate together, and that's how the cabinet is carried. And now you can probably see why I made the sides of the cabinet stick back about 1/2 inch deeper than the rest of it, and that was so that I could bury the French cleat in it, and when it's mounted against the wall, the walnut sides of the cabinet will go all the way flush against the wall itself. And so I'm going to go ahead and glue this French cleat in thoroughly. So the top French cleat here has covered up the hole where the hinge goes through, And so I want to cut a little piece of cherry plywood to go ahead and cover up the hole on the bottom as well. So from the inside, it looks a little more like a solid cabinet. One more final detail sanding of all of the pieces with 400 grit, and then I'll use a tack cloth to wipe off all the surfaces, and then I will proceed to applying my spray finish. My finish of choice for most projects is lacquer, and my favorite lacquer is made by Deft, D-E-F-T, and I'm using a clear semi-gloss lacquer for this project here. Lacquer has the ability to really bring out the grain, makes it look very beautiful, and it's a rock hard and durable finish as well. I gave the entire project 4 coats, and I sanded lightly between coats with 400 grit, and then I did a final sand over the top with 2000 grit when it was all done. And here you can see I am mounting the glass retaining clip. This will flip over out of the way and then flip back in the way once we put the glass in place, and we can screw the thumb screw portion down onto the glass panel to hold it in place. And you can see them there all in place, and all the hardware is done, and it's ready to have the glass put in. And finally, this is the French cleat portion, which will be attached to the wall, and how it will help hang the cabinet. And so there we have it. We got to see a display case project that included some Dado and Rabbet joinery and included a glass panel door. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching, and please consider subscribing to our channel. Thank you very much.